It's 8 according to my watch.
Okay, let me put my talk on the screen if I can here. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon or this evening session. I'm going to begin, the structure will be that I will begin by making my presentation, followed by the next speaker who will make hers, and then there'll be time for questions at the end. My presentation, the title is Keeping Science Reform Secular Amidst the Replication Crisis. And I will presume a certain amount of familiarity with the replication crisis in psychology, but if you don't know it specifically, it's rather easy to sum up. There have been a number of publications finding that the rate at which empirical psychological studies could be reproduced was much lower than would be expected, and that was a source of concern for the future of the science. The thesis, just to look ahead of what I'm going to say, is that replication activism, which is going to be my topic, has been spurred by this crisis, that movement has been driven by a kind of secular enlightenment-oriented scientific values such as openness, antagonism to unmerited authority. However, it seems to me, and I will argue that ironically at some points that movement may itself be producing kind of taboos that make it hard to assess the utility of the movement and to make judgments about its future. So as not to be understood, let me note that I think it's done many good things and that my focus is specifically that I'm particularly interested in the focus on replication failure and its influence on the discourse. As background to it, my interest developed in a kind of shift in that I observed in the sentiments toward an identification with a sort of tough-minded view of science. I first noticed it at the New York City March for Science early in the Trump administration. There was the spectacle of many progressives in the streets chanting in favor of science, which everyone was for, but it was also a source of reflection to me that many of the people that I knew there had also occupied a good bit of their career with critiquing science for its positivism, reductionism, etc. And I think we get a glimpse of the shift in sentiments about science in the discourse on COVID. Follow the science is both a survival tactic in planning responses to the pandemic, but also a kind of cultural marker to antagonism to Trump policy. And in particular, my framework says is that this shift has been a relative shift in emphasis from two kind of inheritances from the Enlightenment. And one is a move from a focus on critique as a way of understanding and testing findings by reflecting on what interests they might serve or how they might fit into institutional locations, to a different one of emphasizing testing, transparency, accountability as signs of a kind of scientific way of disciplining opinion. And those are two different ones, but a shift in the direction of the latter. And in this, replication has functioned as a kind of detection system, as a touchstone of good science, as a kind of culturally charged rallying cry, and it expresses a kind of close identification with the cross-disciplinary open science movement, which is important historically, I think, because in the development of the open science movement, the biting. I think criticism of psychology was an important step, and that is the identification in the article in Science that I showed earlier, pointed to it was a kind of case study for the importance of replication as a way of testing science. And there's some risks that go with that. As I said, good things, but it's also functioned, I think, replication as a kind of emblem of everything that is good science, and as its opposite, that's dialectically created a kind of class or grouping as everything that fails to meet that test. And one risk is that it has tended, I think, to draw bright lines between good science and the rest. And in addition, because replication is such a powerful image of the capacity of science for self-correction, a kind of democratic open market of ideas for challenging inherited ideas, it has tended to infuse with significance that whole grouping of questionable research practices that it implicitly identifies. It's been a very powerful movement in its association with the open science movement, has been important. It has done a lot. There have been many social characteristics that have worked to draw in additional people to be involved in the process of reforming science, multiple investigators, inviting volunteer investigators to join in the work. And it rhetorically, however, I want to point to a risk posed by the function of this movement in enforcing a kind of code. And it's has pluses and minuses, but I think it's clear that, like any activist movement, this activist movement thrives on blame. That is, you organize activity around identifying something bad and mobilizing effort to eliminate it. But of course, non-replication is not just about knowledge. When someone's experiment is exposed as non-replicable, that carries a negative reputational sanction. Now, I think many people who do this try to do it in a pretty even-handed way, but it's also, I think, just true that some of the attacks have been very rough and hard on people. But there have been suggestions for the creation of a system for scrutinizing publications that will identify investigators who have multiple non-replications. And I think that it is fair to say that the social sanctions and, you know, quote unquote policing function are a feature and not a bug. And I've labeled these the eyes of Brücke effect after Ernst von Brücke, a 19th century physician researcher who some of you may be familiar with as a teacher of Freud, and he was famous for his demanding standards. Freud called him the greatest authority I ever met, and I couldn't find the source of this quotation, so I had to reproduce it from memory. But Freud says, and I think it's somewhere in the Interpretation of Dreams, that whenever I felt the temptation to shirk duty, I would see those eyes which would recall me to that duty. And he spoke of his terrible blue eyes of Brücke. And I think if we map this effect onto the intended effect of replication activism, it is to make people more aware of these standards and to shape their own behavior in response to the anticipation that reproachful eyes might view them. And that can have good effects, but there may also be some limits to consider in assessing those. And just to mention a few, I think that, like all movements, this is one that tends to have, I think, a kind of expansionist trajectory. I want to raise questions about whether, as it expands and grows, if the effects will be identical to the ones that have been recorded so far. And I think there are three kinds of reasons. One, that we should be alert to that. One is that this grouping of non-replicable studies includes a diversity of causes. That is, there are lots of different reasons a study might not replicate. Some are fraudulent or criminal. There's carelessness, this kind of stubbornness, out-of-date analytic approaches. And then a question that could be raised is, does the central tool of identifying non-replications, does it, how well does it apply to the multiple different causes that might produce a non-replication? And I think that's okay for some, but for many others, it doesn't work so well, and it may even, in some ways, backfire. There's also, I think we should just be frank, a diversity in the significance of studies that fail to replicate, and some bad science is incredibly important, a fact we don't need reminding of in the middle of an epidemic. People's lives will be at stake, but I also think that it's just worth admitting that many studies, some of which probably won't replicate, are limited in their significance. And studies are published because they reflect intellectual fads or pressure from a department, or a tenure clock is ticking, or different things. And a question I'll raise in a moment is, how do we talk about whether they are worth exposing? And a third reason is that I think that, looking to the future, a lot of the early replication efforts were targeted at big names and high visibility studies. And I think that helped to sort of crystallize the spirit behind it, because part of this scientific ethos or mindset is not being afraid to take on big reputations and received wisdom, and kind of holding propositions to account regardless of who makes them. And that's very, I think, consistent with this spirit. But I think that with successing waves, as the movement tries to grow, I wonder if the effect will be the same as it exposes less professionally secure investigators, as it devotes time and effort to studies that may not be worth exposing. And I think that there is, a recognition of this, and I think one qualification about replication activism, it's already yielded from within the very framework that motivates it a number of more qualified and less absolutist judgments. And I list some of those here. For time, I'm not going to go through all of them. But there are some questions that I think we need room to be able to ask. And that is, at some point, might this Brücke effect begin to inhibit scientific risk-taking? And so studies that would be a shame to lose, will it steer young investigators away from humanly important topics that are hard to research just because the phenomena isn't well described yet, or the literature isn't advanced enough, or because methods are still evolving to study it? And also, I think that it's worth mentioning that some lines of research, or this is an opinion, but don't really yield good science, but they do other things, like they start good conversations based on their failures, or also because they bring topics or concepts to the attention of the public and of the scientific community. And if one product is that we have fewer of those, will there be some cost involved there that's worth assigning a weight to. And the difficulty, I think, and this is what I'm trying to put my finger on, is that it's a little bit hard within the terms of replication activism to know how to talk about these countervailing considerations. So, you know, maybe put a bit more technically, even if there's been a big yield in benefit for science from early efforts to expose these studies that don't hold up to replication, it's quite conceivable that the benefits may differ in their effect as they mount up. There might be, for example, a kind of curvilinear relation to outcomes, so that if the vertical axis is the total benefit to science, and the horizontal axis might be time, or the number of exposures, or the percent of experiments that are tested for replication, it might be very beneficial at first, and then it might plateau or decrease in the yield that it produces. And even if the early non-replication exposures yielded big knowledge benefits and positive as a Brücke effects, you know, it seems likely to me that there's a point of diminishing returns. How close to zero replication failures would we need to get? And it's hard to discuss this question because it seems to suggest applying a cost-benefit analysis to the creation of scientific truth, which is an uncomfortable sort of an assertion. So someone listening to me might say, are you really saying psychology ought to endorse just leaving in place large numbers of studies that are unlikely to replicate? Are you saying that we should identify fewer non-replicable studies because it discourages people or because it takes too much time and effort? It seems wrong in a way to put a price on that dedication to truth. But these strictures also make it hard, I think, to even discuss trade-offs that might be involved. And here I think a framework that is useful is to think of the sacred value research that is associated with Philip Tetlock, where he says a sacred value is one that a moral community treats as possessing transcendental significance that precludes comparisons, trade-offs, or indeed any mingling with secular values, and that violations of a sacred value elicit harsh trait attributions, support for various kinds of punishment, and even support for punishing those who are unwilling to punish others. So it's a very powerful kind of an effect when it is recognized. But something that Tetlock makes clear, and I think this is very important, using terms from economics, he says that what's involved are expressed preferences and not revealed preferences. That is, these sacred value protection norms stop people from talking about the things that violate taboos, but nevertheless, they do trade off these things. The example that gets used sometimes is that, you know, we would, even though we don't like to talk about trading off lives, you know, most people would accept that at 30 miles per hour speed limit, there'd be fewer deaths. And being able to go faster predictably increases the loss of life. And people do make those choices. It's just we don't like talking about them. Tetlock says that the one typical strategy among policymakers is just to obscure the nature of the choice. And it occurred to me that there's an anecdote that in a way captures how to introduce these considerations into the picture that I'm talking about. And that is one that's from a graduate school mentor of mine, Jerry Bruner. And those who remember him may know that something he loved was when people were speaking at talks, he would just chatter away in these little very loud whispers, And and I remember one in particular where a speaker was going on and on about psychology as a soft science, and Brunner, sort of speaking to everyone around him, said, well, the great thing about a soft science is it doesn't hurt so much when you fall on your ass. And I remember thinking at the time how well that captured a sort of adventuresome spirit of Brunner's, and how he had been willing to go into lots of different areas and, you know, make contributions that he later, you know, in a way called into question. I know he mentioned to me he's a father of the cognitive revolution, and I think he talked about how its good effect was to make people more aware of agency and the role of mind, but that he felt it had in some ways been a dead end, and it was time to move on. So I offer that anecdote as a balance to the eyes of Brücke, and with the suggestion that the challenge is to find a way to balance or find a middle road between the eyes of Brücke effects and the Brunner's bottom effect, which is to tolerate a certain amount of falling down in a soft science. Okay, thank you. So, Anna.
Hello. So this is me. I'm going to present, if I can, and then we'll go to the questions. Okay, thank you, Jamie. Let's see if I can share part of my screen. Okay, I think you can see my slides now, right? Yes. Hello everybody, and thank you for joining us here today. This is actually my first Zoom conference paper, so I hope everything will go smoothly. Before I start talking about my paper, I ought to tell you a little bit about my background. I did my PhD dissertation in comparative literature, oral traditions, and cultural identity. And since 2013, I work at the University of Navarra, where I teach communication and world literatures in English. And for the past 6 years, I've been immersed in doing research in the field of testimony and live writing as a way to explore how identity is being narrated by human rights activists that want to change the world. I am currently collaborating with the Emotional Culture and Identity Project at the Institute for Culture and Society at the University of Navarra here in Spain. And we are especially interested in how embedded emotions are in our sense of who we are, the interplay of individual and collective identities, how identities are constructed by means of narrative and are always being shaped and shaping culture and other external forces. In this regard, I am particularly inspired by Paul John Eakins' definition of narrative identity and how we are stored selves, whose identity is constructed through self-narration. In Eakins' words, narrative is not something we tell, listen to, read, or invent. It is an essential part of who we are. Our lives are relational, meaning our identity is never only a matter of the individual, but it is also collaboratively produced. Previous research in autobiography or life writing as a broader umbrella term demonstrates those core tenets inextricably linked to theories of emotions, sociology, psychology, and narrative. I have been studying over the past few years, and for this forthcoming book with Paul Grave, how traumatic experiences and violence of various kinds are negotiated via testimonial life narrative. In my book, New Forms of Self-Narration, Young Women, Life Writing and Human Rights, I look at contemporary cases of young women activists seeking to bring to light forms of abuse they have witnessed and or endured, to call for an end to injustice, usually starting as something local, but soon becoming global phenomena. And as I was finalizing my project, as it happened to other speakers here at this conference, my country was overcome by COVID-19. So both in and outside my pages, I witnessed multiple crises: a public health crisis, an economic crisis, a refugee crisis, a human rights crisis, a political crisis, a climate crisis, so many crises. Some of these crises existed well before the pandemic, and others were newly recreated. These crises can be condensed into what one might call a broader social crisis, or alternatively, reflect a kaleidoscope of global crises in line with the rationale for this conference. But how does the insidious concept of crisis permeate media discourse and seep into people's minds? Here, I need to say something about the idea of crisis itself. Though etymologically it apparently stands for the ability to critically analyze a situation and look for solutions, due to its being overused, it has become more and more difficult to define the specific features for an event, series of events or phenomenon to be categorized as such. Though of course fluctuating in meaning, crisis is, in the words of Patrona, a mediated social practice, socially constituted, talked into being in and through public discourses, constructed. The performance of crisis lends itself to the discursive construction of specific ideologically imbued narratives, end of quote. These narratives of crisis are all around us, a pervasive feature of our times. And indeed, everything I've been writing about for the past 6 years deals with some sort of crisis. As the Ricker warns in his contribution to Crisis in the Media, one needs to approach with caution the traumatic emotions during crisis engenders, not only because of those affects it generates, but because of its role in homogenizing and downplaying difference. The label crisis turns, in the words of Selitzer, murky and troublesome challenges into a controllable phenomenon that can be identified, articulated, managed, and ultimately gotten rid of, end of quote. The narrative of the crisis has focused on tracking the virus, scientific jargon, statistics, economic impact, and has led to an eventual declaration of state of emergency, which in Spanish was called estado de alerta, and which provoked precisely that which it announced, acute alertness, coupled with high levels of anxiety. In Spain, a particular semantic field has grounded the discursive framing of the SARS-CoV-2 virus and COVID-19, and that is war. In most political actors' public interventions, all too frequent, I must say, the pervasiveness of the word war and related metaphors is all too evident. This is a worrying trend that needs to be addressed and redressed, as my colleague at the ICS, Ines Olza, and others soon realized, launching the initiative online Reframe COVID, now a website as well as a hashtag on Twitter. As she recently explained, the mobilization of the hashtag is not a project, but a social initiative and a collective movement, where academics in the humanities have an opportunity to act as mediators in addressing the radical need for alternative frames. It is a call for action, seeking to enroll and soliciting engaged, active citizen participation. In my work on activism, I have found that activists usually rely on existing templates and frameworks of reference, which may have positive outcomes. In that sense, deploying strategic frames in one's narrative should not make readers' audiences weary, quite the opposite. The strategic wielding of emotions, I have previously argued, and strategic framing of the story serves to reach an ever-widening audience with the intention of provoking an empathic response. Using repetition as a rhetorical device ever since Aristotle has been a distinctly successful mechanism for orators and public speakers to persuade citizens, politicians trying to win voters over included. Multimodal repetition across media and platforms, moreover, in the digital society in which we are currently living, affords the promotion of awareness and engagement, as shown by the Iteration as Persuasion series project at Cambridge, with which I have recently collaborated. In the case of COVID-19, however, the excessive repetition of terms that carry negative connotations, such as war, fight, battle, crisis, does not lead to increased public engagement. Rather, it provokes rejection, fatigue, and disenchantment, to say the least. So perhaps, as Olza and others have been suggesting in the media and on Twitter, we need new frames, new ways of narrating this crisis. Here, I propose looking at culture and memory to learn from the past and guide us in how to reshape the current panorama of media discourse on the crisis. While the idea of collective memory was coined in the 20s in France by Maurice Holbachs, it remains a contested term due to its apparent emphasis on the collective and group dynamics over the individual. And I'm not going to read the French that you see on your screens, hopefully. I quite agree with Michael Rothberg's reading of Holbach's definition as the understanding that all memories are simultaneously individual and collective. But though very much connected, to avoid the problematic term, others like Astrid Erl and Ansgar Nuning propose cultural memory instead. And cultural memory is defined by Mieke Ball as, and I quote, a cultural phenomenon as well as an individual or social one, linking the past to the present and future in productive ways, countering the damaging effects of trauma, giving the voice and space through acts of memory. For Max Saunders, my previous mentor at the Centre for Life Writing Research in King's College London in the UK, apart from its discursive performativity, the concept of cultural memory is concerned, and I'm quoting from Saunders, not with actual events, but their cultural repercussions, not with actual memories, but with memories as representations and with representations of memories, end of quote. As individual and collective memories are entwined, they are also heavily mediated and imbued, I argue, with strong feelings. Inevitably, talk of war in Spain necessarily takes one back to the Civil War, which wounds are not quite healed, something I have been doing research in over the past 2 years for the International Year in Review feature of the journal Biography, looking at several biographies, memoirs, and documentaries that try to handle this legacy. The largest group affected by the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and the one whose survival rate and prognosis is worse, is precisely the elderly. Now, constantly reminiscing the war and post-war periods they either experienced or were near witnesses to, potentially subjects our elders to unnecessary, I would say, re-traumatization. I am not the only one to have become concerned with the symptoms akin to PTSD resurfacing in the elderly population. Take my grandmother, Luisa, my sole remaining grandparent. She's not there in the picture, but she could have been one of the 2 kids in the background, because this picture was taken in Asturias, which is in the north of Spain, where we are from. She's now 92. She was born in 1928, meaning she lived through the Civil War, which was from 1936 to 39, as a child, and the post-war years in her teens. Ever since the start of the enforced self-isolation or lockdown last March, she has been overwhelmed by all this talk of war and post-war, and her rambling mind, which works now on and off depending on the day, goes back to all those years and the hardship she endured and witnessed, to stories of hunger and deprivation, families ruined, alcoholism, and a whole range of too personal traumas to be disclosed here. Recollections of the pain of losing loved ones to famine, of siblings maimed or even killed by inexplicable, incurable diseases like polio, feeling insurmountable difficulties looming in the horizon, not quite grasping the reasons why. So much more is in her mind as we speak. She refuses to linger in the past, lest she goes crazy. Memories are too painful. Now, every time this vocabulary of war, fighting, surviving comes up, she is reminded that back then, and I'm kind of translating, at least my mom grew potatoes, that's what she says. And she wonders swearingly, what would we do? No one is planting potatoes anymore. And she insists. She asks her questions and she doesn't wait for a response. And as usual, I laugh. It's ironic because it's too true. We take too many things for granted. What consequences does being confined, isolated, in lockdown, however you want to call it, over an extended period of time, year, well over 2 months, have for one's psyche? Scholars have studied this issue in relation to prison inmates and how they deal with immobility. More recently, the so-called refugee crisis in Europe brought to the fore the damaging consequences for asylum seekers' minds when placed in detention centers without an exit date. I do not wish to compare these highly different cases. After all, most of us are confined to the relative luxury of our homes, which should mean comfort and security. But there are exceptions. Many women's rights advocates and feminist scholars have noted the dire strain this imposes on women being forced to cohabit, practically imprisoned with their abuser at home. And what of the belated and or solely online grieving and mourning for the departed loved ones? What about the elderly living alone who, like my grandma, do not understand any of this? Technology is offering support to these groups, and there's reason to be grateful. Yet, what of the digital divide? Not everybody has access to the internet, nor knows how to use it. How do we account for this dilemma between wanting to help and be there, and being forbidden to do so by the authorities? How do we cope with the so-called relaxation or easing measures that decide theoretically in the citizens' best interests? It is safer to meet your friends to party, drink at a bar, or go to the gym before one can visit one's family, and all just because they happen to live 3 hours away. I am not a doctor or a psychologist. I do not claim to know better than medical experts. I just hope with all my heart that when this is over, and hopefully things will go, if not back to normal, at least not to a place where we have turned into automata, unable to care for those who have given us everything. Looking to the future makes societies move forward, but we shouldn't forget our heritage and the role our elders played and can still play in our lives. It is too painful to contemplate so many who have died alone in a room or out in the open without somebody holding their hand or kissing them goodbye. Can we go out of this crisis and emerge on the other side with a deeper care for families? Can we learn to value what we have? I would like to conclude very briefly by suggesting an avenue for radical action now in our hands. Let's start by changing the narrative. We need other metaphors apart from military ones, and we need them urgently. Metaphors and narratives, I'd say, that will not contribute as current ones do to the mental health crisis some of us are experiencing. New discursive frames, which can provide a new lens to grasp reality and the interconnections or bonds that hold us together, not divide us. We need personal stories, as I've been saying, that are able to both appeal to and to move people because of the emotional impact those stories have beyond the cold data statistics. We should often be reminded, unlike the trend these days in mass media and politicians' public addresses, that we are not numbers, we are people, each of us with their particular story and feelings, context and values. We need to try to understand ourselves and others to gain fuller awareness of the social world in which we live and balance, as Brian Schiff rightly put it in his Q&A the first day of this conference, trying to keep as best we can the social body healthy. In the face of trauma, past and present coalesce. Memories re-emerge, but are reshaped in the process of mediation. Just as there are many crises apart from the medical emergency, there are many traumas that may become conflated as certainty, in the words of Roger Free, gives way to uncertainty. Perhaps we can reframe these times as a human experience, focusing on what we do share. Initiatives such as Reframe COVID and Una Historia Más Humana, a student-led initiative to record and archive personal experiences so that future generations will look back on this period of time and find a more humane or more human history or story, may be examples of possible ways forward, asking people for collaboration as we try to rethink what the future may be, what it might look like. As Molly Andrews eloquently argued in her thought-provoking plenary last Thursday, after this rupture of the everyday, let us find new hope for futures that, as she then expanded in the Q&A, allow us to rethink how we want to live our lives as individuals, but also as communities. We construct our future through personal choices and habits. In these unexpected crossroads, as Ana Marta González put it, we should reflect on what we can do to make the world a bit more humane. And this is the last slide, I promise. Are we learning from this crisis, as many assert, I wonder, to prepare ourselves for future crises? What should be done to lessen the harm made by war rhetoric and measures? The solution may be to consider the implications of living through crisis, which is a rupture of the everyday for us, but not so much for others. An opportunity to see those who surround us as human beings in their own right, entitled to the same freedoms and rights as us. A potential to come closer and bridge the gap between the sadly frequent tendency towards neglecting and othering practices, particularly in public discourse. Let us find spaces of reconciliation that can bring people together across difference, acknowledging and learning to value those differences, which after all make us human. Our identities are always in the making, relational, created and recreated. We are all fundamentally dependent on one another, in the words of Roger this week. Understanding that no man is an island will prove crucial, I believe, if we are to value solidarity and those around us as part of who we are. Thank you. And that's it. And now I think we can take questions, right, Jamie? Or you can tell me what you think. Did it work?
I enjoyed your talk very much. Something that occurred to me in the course of your description, particularly in the narrative framing, is how a challenge for us always in narrating is that we don't know what future chapters lie ahead and how those will alter the meaning of what we're reflecting on now. And that seems like a tension in a way that's always there. And I don't know if you have thoughts on that in the context of this, or how, if at all, that should shape our reflection.
I mean, it's more of a thought than a question and an answer, right? I think, well, it's like a trope, but identities are like fluid, right? And very much always been, constructed again and again, right? So, for instance, if I think of all these, like, so-called crises or whatever, what you thought at the beginning is not what you thought the following week or the following month, and it's not how you felt after your colleague's mom died, and it's not the same as where we are now. Because now, in theory, here in Spain, we are like sort of free to move around, but I see, and as I explained in the talk, I see some ironies. That is a little bit how we connect, right? In the talk, some ironies in the ways that you can do certain things that to me make no sense because I don't need to do them. I don't like drinking and I don't like partying. I don't, and I would very much like to see my grandma because she's alone and she's 92 and it was her birthday and she spent it alone. Mm. And of course she's too old to understand what a computer is and and this kind of thing, but perhaps in 1 year's time we will look back on this time and it won't look so horrible. Maybe time changes our perceptions, I think.
Yes, thank you.
And of course, I admit that we are very much privileged. That's something I also said in the talk, that at least we have this home, you have your home, and so many people are living in the streets, and and like the refugees I am writing about, right? I mean, as I was trying to put the final touches on my book, I was wondering, you know, this is like, well, not ridiculous, but let's finish this because it's, why am I even complaining, right? But I'm not really complaining. I'm just stating some facts that I feel are out of the public discourse. You know, people focus on statistics, and that's okay. I think we need them, but we need something different and more humane also. So, questions. I was thinking about good science, bad science that you were kind of insisting, and was thinking of what do you think of like digital affordances, the fact that it's so easy to retweet and distribute information, and I guess that something scientific looking, you know, can appear scientific, but maybe it's not true. It's part of this fake news cycle, you know, and then you are like part of it. How do you account? Is that good science because it gets replicated?
Oh, by replication, I meant more narrowly, and I think the activists I was talking about, they mean to undertake the same activities as the original experiment and whether it yields the same outcomes as before. And I think that that's, you know, I guess I tried to express two attitudes toward it. I think that's a very reasonable demand to make. I just also wanted to point up some limitations of it, I think. But I'm not sure if I'm responding to the part about the digital replication. Is that?
Because the activism they carry out, is it online sometimes or only
Well,
it's
like a kind of a social pressure on investigators who have reported effects or outcomes in the academic literature. And people say, oh, well, that sounds good and that made you famous. But when I try to do that in my lab, and what's more, when all these other people try to do it in their labs, we don't get that effect.
Yeah.
And while that is a problem, and it's a reasonable question to ask, I wanted to ask if there are ways in which it may produce unintended consequences that are worth, you know, considering.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not a scientist, but my husband is. He's a biochemist, so it is quite struggle, right? When you get one experiment right, and then you cannot really replicate it exactly.
No, it's a very nervous feeling when that happens.
Yeah. So I am on the other side, seeing the effect.
Yes.
I don't know if we have questions. Have you noticed in the Q&A?
I'm not sure here. Let's see.
I'm not sure if I can see if we have questions, but feel free if there's people in the audience who want to ask any questions. If not, we can continue talking.
Okay.
Okay, I was thinking of open science movement, right? And then you said something about the New York and the rally cry. Yeah.
Yeah.
It made me think of Greta Thunberg, where, well, maybe it's not the same thing, but she is also one of the activists that I'm tracking for a paper, and the motto of follow the science or listen to the science and everything that's gone after that. That's what I was thinking about when you were talking about that. Does it relate?
Well, I'm not sure. I guess what interested me and was that there are some ironies. And another example might be how in the US there's a very, there are disputes in which public officials will say, I want to follow the science and that's it. And I want facts. And that's a very understandable emphasis. And more what people on the right will say, well, there's no such thing as perfect safety. The economy is important, and perhaps we have to restart the economy. And they are making, the irony, I think, is that you hear in some quarters, people making the argument that, well, the threats to life and well-being and health don't just come from viruses, they also come from unemployment and social conditions. And that's an argument that historically comes more from the left. And that is, they'd say, well, you need a broader view of what predicts health and well-being, not just one focused on viruses. And that the irony is that you hear echoes of that voiced, I guess, from the right now sometimes. And it's, I think, a reflection of this, the sort of shifting sentiments about how people within that culture think about, or within the culture, I guess most academics
you mentioned people, activists, right? Replication activists being anti-Trump, right? And
yes.
In that regard, I guess that followers of climate change activists, you know, they of course they collide sometimes, not on purpose, but obviously they collide. Because
well, right, it's now much more. It's now much more part of how views from more progressive quarters are articulated to include science and the importance of paying attention to science. I'm old enough to remember a time where much of the intellectual effort on the left involved critiques of science and reasons to be very cautious about accepting scientific conclusions. And so I think that's some of the shift that I wanted to point to.
Yeah, well, you did. Thank you.
I think we're getting some questions.
Let's see, I can respond. Answer. I don't need to click on anything, right? Well, I have a couple, well, they are related. Well, thank you. I am happy that you like to talk. Alternative narratives that could be better, right? Or alternative framings of crisis. Okay, of course there are examples in Spain and elsewhere of attempts to frame the crisis of something that is not really a crisis or something other than war. But I find that they are quite muted. They are like in the background because the persisting metaphor is all the time war, battle, fight, blah, blah, blah. And even the latest metaphor they're using now, which is like climbing back down the mountain, I don't really like it either. I think from the beginning, what we needed was something more, well, a narrative of care, of people together and joining in an effort, but not really a war effort. Because we depend on each other, and we have seen that over the past few months, that if one person gets sick, very easily the rest of the people can get sick. And I don't think the media, with their focus on transmission being, you know, like enemies and whatever, it hasn't really helped people grasp how important it is to value those around you. I think well, I don't want to be pessimistic, but sometimes I see people, you know, it's like they don't care about anything. I'm okay, and I'm like, yeah. But yeah, narratives of care. So any attempt that we see, I think, as my colleague and her initiative, Reframe COVID, or my student, Alfonso, at our faculty. I work at the well, I forgot to say the faculty. I work at ISA, which is the Faculty of Management Assistance at the University of Navarra. And one of our students launched an initiative on his own, which was called Una Historia Más Humana. And it can be translated into two things, which is a more humane history or a more human story. And basically what he does is he collects letters for the future. So he's going to build an open archive with the experiences of people telling what was before, how they are living through it, and what they look forward to in the future. And I think it's a beautiful initiative, because no one told him to do it. And I'm the typical teacher always saying, you know, my background is literature. I'm the humanities person in the faculty of business, saying, you know, we are not numbers. Remember, we're people, not numbers. So I am actually very glad that the message seeping in. And I think that's what we need. So in our hands, we can do what is in our hands, you know, little things. I think the way we behave can help others. And for instance, online, I'm not the most, you know, digital person. I am learning. This is my first Zoom. But the way I try is I use Twitter to like give prominence to the things that I value, and that's the.
That sounds like a wonderful initiative, and also in a way very generous to the people who come after us in being able to look back at it. One thing that occurred to me as alternative narratives is I think that sometimes one hears a kind of narrative of revelation, and you know, you hear people talking about their appreciation of essential workers, especially low-paid essential workers, and how important they are. And I've heard people say, oh, they really should get more money for their wages and stuff. Also, revelations, I think a lot of people, I certainly have, am appreciative of the time I've been able to spend at home. And I think a lot of people have a new appreciation of being with families and with the kind of interaction that promotes, and also the unpolluted skies, and, you know, hearing the birds and things like that. I mean, you don't have to be you know, too sentimental about it, but I think that there have been ways that in the midst of this very, very bad thing, people have feel they've been made aware of values that, you know, they'd been diverted from or hadn't been as aware of.
Yeah. And also something, because there were two similar questions. So I see one from Rosalia, who's actually my mentor at the university. So thank you, Rosalia, for tuning in. I think that we shouldn't forget either something that several of the speakers at these conferences have been talking about, which is vulnerability, which in essence is inevitable, and suffering is inevitable. So there should be some radical acceptance. I think they were saying in a plenary earlier today of how that is part of who we are. And that's not common either in the news. And it's either the discourse of who's the stronger person and can live through it, not so much about who's struggling, and many people are struggling, and many people have lost, you know, family and friends. So yeah, there should be spaces where we can reconcile that, and yeah. But yeah, I think we're almost, yeah. Maybe we can take one more question, final question, if someone in the audience has a final question, perhaps for us. And yeah, otherwise, yeah, initiatives such as this conference are great because yeah, we're far apart, but it's nice that we can have this conversation, right? And
no,
across
it's marvelous.
different fields, because it is highly interdisciplinary as well.
Yes. No, it feels, thinking of narrative, it feels like in a way the beginning of something new, like that perhaps we'll be able to communicate transnationally and through more organized events like this. That would be something good.
Yeah, positive outcome.
Well, one anyhow. Yeah.
One.
Okay. So I think that we say goodbye now.
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And thank you for our participants. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.